Hi. So let's start a bit bold here with a quick journey to the past. To be more specific, let's get to the verge of the 19th and 20th century, to Harvard Observatory. There, William Pickering hired a group of women who would work on analyzing data from images. They were called Pickering's harem, which, well, speaks volumes about the amount of recognition they got. And they did quite a tedious manual job, but through that, they managed to do so many great contributions into astronomy. This wasn't the only instance of women being used as the so-called human computers. In fact, the history of computing is pretty much meaningless without women. Let's fast forward to the 1940s, when we have ENIAC, what is now considered to be the first computer, and some of you guessed it, probably. It was programmed by women, which wasn't any novelty at the time. Hardware was considered to be for men. Software was a female domain. So why is it that now, when we try to picture a stereotypical programmer, we are most likely to see a man, certainly a well-paid one, right? Well, in the 1960s, as computer science gained more and more recognition, men started entering the field. And as they had higher chances of getting a promotion or had job criteria being set predominantly for them, within 3 decades, the demographic shifted to what we experience now. There are a few takeaways from that story. Firstly, women made all of those contributions because they were just as capable to do that. I hope it's as obvious as it sounds. And secondly, the fact that their achievements continue to be either belittled, attributed to men, or not talked about at all is just another example of the continuous narrative that shapes the disproportions we see in many fields up to this day. And whenever I start this conversation, there is always a voice saying that, well, maybe women simply have different interests. Maybe they have different capabilities. Maybe they are naturally drawn towards this and that. I genuinely wish it was that simple. But our ways of telling history are yet another reproductions of the biases that we acquire at a very young age. The biases that affect not only what we see in history textbooks or in the media, but also that affect the choices we make for ourselves and the way we see us as individuals. In fact, that is what heavily influenced my choices at school. As a girl really interested in STEM for a long time, I felt reluctant to take part in some activities out of fear of being the odd one out. And that is the struggle that I still face sometimes, even though it's hard to admit. But enough about my personal story. Let's take a look at some solid data that we have, starting with a Draw a Scientist study. I guess you already know what the premise is. A child is asked to draw a scientist of any kind. And since those studies have been done for 50 years or so, we have a pretty good idea on how the tendencies shift as well. So what did we learn? First, good news. Girls draw women way more often than they did 50 years ago. The percentage shifted from a little over 1 to 58%. That is great that things are improving. There is some bad news, though. As a girl gets older, she is more and more likely to draw a man instead. Here, the percentage changes from 70% in 60-year-old girls to only 25% in 16-year-olds. So as a girl gets older, she is less and less likely to see a scientist, potentially herself, in that role. And it's not only about what jobs girls can choose in the future, it's also about how smart they think they are. There is a US study from 2017 that presented children starting primary school with a game for kids who are really, really smart. And while in the group of 5-year-olds, children of both sexes were just as likely to volunteer, 6-year-old girls were already reluctant. So now, let that sink in. We have 6-year-old girls that are starting primary education, they already start thinking they are less smart, exceptional perhaps, than boys. And that is just the beginning. Later on in the education, we have OECD reports that show the girls' gross lack of self-confidence when it comes to mathematics and science. And an interesting caveat here, the more classroom-specific or stereotypically male-associated the topic, the less confident they felt. And with that lack of self-confidence, perhaps even anxiety, which girls are more likely to exhibit in class, come worse results. And another important thing, closely related to self-confidence, the overwhelming issue of women speaking up, or, well, not speaking up, because they do not talk as much as men do. And even when they do decide to speak up, it simply isn't viewed the same way. This is something called the descriptive and prescriptive bias in action. It is essentially about associating certain traits or behaviors with a group and then expecting that group to exhibit them. And well, with the way we display women in history, we just don't see them as great scientists or leaders. And so when we see a woman, even a girl, trying to take that role, there is a bit of dissonance here. And from that, we are just more likely to view her as cold, bossy, dramatic. To me, as a 17-year-old, this sounds way too familiar than it should. So those expectations make their mark really early on. As early as 6-year-olds. Let me state that again. So we have girls who think they are less smart, girls that are anxious about exhibiting certain interests, girls that are reluctant to speak up. And those are some major setbacks for a developing human being. And let me state one thing clearly. I genuinely hope it would go without saying. Gender biases are a double-edged sword. They affect both sides. Saying that the issue does not affect you because you're a man is beside the point. You'll have different challenges ahead of you, that's for sure. But research actually shows that boys are more likely to be discouraged or punished for feminine-associated behaviors. On a much bigger scale, one might say we have quite a bit of challenges ahead of us. Climate change, wars, and so on and so on. On our way of solving them, we might want to come up with some technological or policy solutions to help us along the way. How are we supposed to do that? With over half of the population that is either not male, not white, not straight, being kept from achieving their fullest potential. I don't want to sound overly dramatic here, but let's just leave it at inefficient. Is that okay? This is a huge issue that I tried to take a minute to speak about today. I wish I had one simple answer to it, but the truth is, if there was one answer, I wouldn't be standing here today. However, let me tell you one thing. If you manage to keep one child's interests and confidence intact, that already means changing one whole life. And that is priceless. So let's do all we can. Display women role models. Let's use inclusive language and encourage girls to speak their minds and pursue their interests, because as obvious as it may sound, this is very much needed. And if you don't believe me, that's okay, just go ahead and check the data, because first and foremost, we need to educate ourselves. Learning about the biases that we have gives us the power to see their influence and actually do something about it. So educate yourself, educate others, and with the knowledge that you will have earned, be mindful of the consequences of whatever you say and whatever you do. Because while we can't change the past, we can't just get rid of our acquired biases, what we can do is try to influence the future, despite the baggage that we have. Thank you.